Hello, horrorphiles. You're listening to Dissecting Horror,
examining the anatomy of fear in film, television, and literature.
I'm filmmaker Stephen Aguilera.
I'm writer and performer Kelsey Zukowski.
In this episode, we'll examine Van Helsing, starring Hugh Jackman, Kate Beckinsale, and directed by Stephen Sommers. This dissection will be spoiler-free.
We are the Horror Whisperers, your champions of horror.
In our society of grotesquerie and loathing, if you will.
I will, and we hope you will subscribe for more, won't you?
The famed monster hunter Van Helsing is sent to Transylvania to stop Count Dracula, who is using Dr. Frankenstein's research and a werewolf for nefarious purposes, according to IMDB. I have watched this film many times over the last 20 years, but unlike guilty pleasures such as The Haunting, 1999, I view this with something of a morbid fascination. It's not hate-watching, as there is much to be admired in the sets, costumes, makeup effects, and props. Put it this way, I've had this film on standard DVD this whole time, never quite feeling the need to upgrade to Blu-ray or 4K, if that's any indication. I don't think it's a terrible movie for what it was trying to be, but there's something silly and juvenile about it where we could have gotten something darker and deeper, especially considering the content upon which it was based. I marvel at the enormous production value invested, all in a direction that completely missed the mark.
Van Helsing has a strong opening that serves as a fun homage and love letter to fans of the original Universal monster films, particularly those later in their respective franchises where the stories intersected to depict this bigger universe. The film begins with the prevalent classic Gothic atmosphere, in black and white as the customary raging violent mob storms Dracula's castle. There is a twist here with Victor Frankenstein, his monster, and Dracula that sets up the story well, even if tweaking some of the characters' roles and how they fall into each other's stories. The style ends with one last look at the sheer horror and pain in the face of Dracula and his brides at the destruction that has occurred. The film initially intrigued me and had me ready to go on a fun, macabre ride of so many classic horror archetypes in one film. However, it quickly reverted away from this fun homage and fell deeper into something painfully generic and half-baked, not taking the time with a few more interesting depictions and moments and stretching out the uninteresting ones.
Van Helsing was written and directed by Stephen Sommers, best known for The Mummy in 1999, a film I love, by the way, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. Like Van Helsing, it is a film based on classic horror material, but which tends more toward lighthearted action-adventure instead. In fact, according to IMDb, Van Helsing is listed as action-adventure. According to Box Office Mojo, it's categorized as action-adventure fantasy thriller. There's something almost tragic about a movie which embodies so many classic horror characters and themes, yet is never actually scary, at least not to an adult, despite all the roaring and hissing and baring of teeth. But perhaps I'm too desensitized to frights at this point.
No, I definitely agree that it doesn't take the horror and invest in it as much. It definitely feels more of an action adventure, and even for that, it seemed to be the writing and story and character elements were just very one note and lacking. So even if you are gonna kind of shift gears and make this strictly just a action film. I don't know. I shouldn't say just an action film. Action's not my go-to, go-to genre, admittedly. But I can appreciate them if they're well done and there's something compelling and interesting and exciting about it. So it was interesting mix that the sets and costumes and just being in this sort of Gothic old world monster, familiar territory was exhilarating, and I wanted to go there. I wanted it to be something that I could really sink my teeth into, so to speak.
Well, I'm sure someone somewhere loved this film. I think that the success of The Mummy, with its very similar genre or feel, spurred him to just repeat whatever worked before, but this time it really fell much flatter.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen the Mummy, but I remember really enjoying it. But yeah, this definitely feels like a lesser version where just not as much effort was really put in. Even going from these characters that are so iconic and beloved, it felt like it was just such a, I don't know, like half effort put into them. And like there was little moments of, oh, people love this about this character, let's throw in one line there, and then not really taking the time to show like the layers and what kind of connected to people overall.
I've brought this up a couple of times in previous podcasts, but for some reason the production numbers are listed differently now, though my point still stands. The Mummy had a budget of $80 million. Van Helsing cost twice that at $160 million, yet it was half or even a quarter as good as The Mummy, in my opinion. The more budget it seems you give this man, the less imaginative creativity is displayed. Worldwide, it pulled in just over $300 million. The general rule is that doubling the production budget gives you the actual cost after marketing. If that holds true, this film fell short of breaking even by about $20 million, though I'm sure merchandising and home video made up for that. On Rotten Tomatoes, it holds a 24% critic score and 57% audience score.
Yeah, to that point, after this, he did a film called Odd Thomas, which I really loved, which I imagine was a much, much smaller budget. There might be certain like expectations. I guess you never know what's going on, from certain producers, or we want this type of film, or, certain demands. But yeah, it's definitely a very uninspired film.
And Odd Thomas was quite good, I agree. And that was 2013 and the last thing he ever directed for some reason. I don't know what that means, but there's something interesting there.
The CGI is horrible and incredibly distracting. I love my monsters, but it was hard to even fully enjoy most of the monster-focused transformations and attacks, while I normally would be reveling in them. I appreciate practical effects, not necessarily against partial or even in some cases full CGI if it elevates the material and what you can bring alive. That was definitely not the case here. Even little things like a burning effect on the skin, which is incredibly easy and low cost to do with makeup, had such clearly digitized effects that it just felt fake and took me out of any reality or investment. I imagine they had a makeup artist for beauty makeup on set, but beyond that, it almost seemed like they were determined not to use any real effects at all. There are films and shows with CGI that could certainly be classified as less grounded and more over-the-top cheesy that I still greatly enjoy. The CGI and everything looking fake was a big issue, but the writing and characterizations weren't there to make up for it, and just really kept me from being engaged in it. This film really dragged for me, only giving me small glimmers of characters and writing that would grab me back for a minute, and then inevitably bury itself or revert back to the one-note quality of story and characters.
In watching the commentary, the producer/editor Dave Doucet, I'm probably butchering that, and Stephen Sommers would routinely say, now this here is digital, and all this up to here is digital too, until we get to here, and that's real, as if the digital effects weren't obvious enough. A major thing that breaks this film is its computer-generated effects and the volume of them. The monsters move way too quickly. So much faster than anything of their actual mass should, and so comes across as mere computer-generated entities and not creatures of real physical substance. Even in the mid-2000s, I thought the CG exactly as unworkable as it looks right now, despite the effects being done by premier effects houses Industrial Light and Magic and Weta Digital, among a slew of other independent companies.
After the intro of the film, it moves away from black and white and into color. While I love the dark, gothic, gritty look with vibrant color accents that the aesthetic allows, it seemed a little weird to go from black and white classic Universal monster movie visuals to color with the timeline switch only being 1 year later. I can see the opening was an initial homage moment, but they ultimately wanted the film to be in color. But it seemed like it would have felt more consistent and truer to the world of the story to either be all black and white or all color, at least within this time frame.
In 1931, Van Helsing was portrayed on screen by Edward Van Sloan in Universal's Dracula. Originally an elderly academic, Sommers made him cool, a cross between Indiana Jones, James Bond, and Batman. If I could sum up this film in 3 words, it would be over the top. even crossing the line into ridiculousness. Every performance, whether human or computer-generated, was so sensationalized and ultra-comic book-esque, so exaggerated, nothing seems real anymore. Though I'm sure nothing in this film is meant to be taken too seriously, the overdramatic action does diminish the stakes when it's also cartoonish that nothing feels real. Nothing means anything. Physics-defying acrobatics, dramatic swinging across things, heroic catches, and improbable luck. Lots of flips and dives and high jumps and spinny kicks and twirly swords. Swords. Should be swords, huh? Because the W's.
Yeah.
I'm sure they kept a lot of stuntmen employed on this one. It had more fiery explosions than a Michael Bay film. Every action from small to large is exaggerated to absurd lengths. It's exhausting. I continually found myself shouting, "Oh, fuck off," or "for fuck's sake." Unsurprisingly, Sommers is documented as saying, quote, "Don't let them tell you less is more. More is more," unquote. Yet such extreme action does not make something more exciting, but less, if anything. I was at a concert once where multiple bands performed, and there was this one guy who would play rock guitar at a dazzling pace, which was amazing at first, but during his 30 minutes of nonstop blistering play, it actually got quite boring regardless of his frantic speed. And that's kind of the same thing we're having here. We need things to just either mean something or vary in speeds to the point where it's not just this sort of white noise after a while.
Even in a well-done film, with action sequences, they are just not that exciting or enthralling to me. So even when there is a good story and characters, I mean, I don't mind it. It's part of, if something's escalating, that's the big battle. Yeah, sure, I can go there. But definitely a case like this where there's just less compelling or interesting at all, really. Yeah, it was very over the top and constant and definitely, just took me out of it a little bit more. And there is, as you mentioned, not quite the Van Helsing that we have known in other versions. There's a clear deviation, making him more of a glorified God-touch action hero here, rather than the wise and open-minded doctor and philosopher we know. I didn't hate Van Helsing as a character, but I didn't feel very invested in him either. Like much in the film, he is very one-dimensional and without that much of a personality or identity. To give some credit, it is referenced that he didn't know much about his origins and things of his past. While it gave additional motive to get him to Transylvania on this risky mission to bring down Dracula, it also delivered as somewhat of a throwaway comment. This felt like a missed opportunity to give Van Helsing more yearnings and understanding to at least offer a moment of dramatic impact and potential for character growth.
When you watch Stephen Sommers in the behind-the-scenes interviews or on set or speaking on the commentary, he has this childlike enthusiasm, which in itself is not a bad thing, though perhaps a bit much for my personal tolerance. My point is, I think he lets his excitedness get the better of him. Even on the commentary, his eager nature caused him to continually cut off the producer so he could interject, which was somewhat annoying, frankly. Now, I'm probably in the wrong for this, but it actually takes a lot to get me intrigued about anything. I like to think this works to my advantage since something has to be really compelling for me to consider it in any story of my own. I am not easily pleased. But you could say to Sommers, "Hey, look at this popsicle stick. We should use this in the movie." And he'll grab it and say, yeah, this is so cool. We can use it for it. And you're like, dude, no, I'm fucking with you. It's a terrible idea, but he runs with it anyway. And so you end up with a story written with all the enthusiasm and sophistication of a 14-year-old boy. A PG-13 kids movie, basically. And there's no reason why you can't make a film with that aim. It's a family-friendly and fun thing to a certain audience, I'm sure.
At the same time, it almost feels dispassionate just because if he's enthused, you would think he'd be enthused with the characters that were already established so well in, of course, the original, but there have even been many different variations, some independent films with creative sort of twists or what these characters would look like in modern day. There has been much more inspired versions of these characters. So you would almost think if it was someone, maybe he's just enthused about everything. He's just enthused about making a movie, and that's all he cares about, and cool action scenes and flips and things like that. But yeah, it's almost a little bit of a weird thing to take characters and source material that have so much depth, and if you are passionate about it, and come up with something so lesser, but maybe he doesn't have. Seems like he doesn't have that passion, because that's usually you see it a lot in a lot of horror remakes where they're just cash grab and bring what's familiar without really having a true understanding or passion about what connected to fans and what made it so lasting and compelling and powerful.
When you listen to him on the commentary track, he talks about how much research he did and all the books he read, and he was just totally into it, trying to find out all the mythology. And I don't know where that ended up, but in this film, it is just bizarre, and it feeds into this whole morbid fascination I have with this film, in that obviously a lot of money went into it and a lot of people worked on it, and a lot of effort went to exaggerating every single action. Yet, like, what the fuck? Like, what is this supposed to be? Who's it supposed to be for? What genre is this? If it's so hinged upon these characters, and was even used to promote the re-release of all the Universal films on DVD, you would think that it would at least be scary or take advantage of the core elements that made those so special. And it really doesn't at all.
This film kind of reminded me of, as far as the tone, subgenre, and what they were trying to repackage, the film Dracula Untold about 10 years after this, which was god-awful, and I would say was even worse than this film.
I didn't catch that one.
Consider yourself lucky. But yeah, it as far as like who this is for, those, again, that one's even worse, but it kind of, it seems like whoever it is, producers, again, you can see it from a Hollywood money-making perspective of trying to make the Universal monsters something similar to the success of Marvel, of especially, I would say even more so Dracula Untold. It had this very, I don't know, sort of basics superhero versus villains, but also the weird thing about that one was they specifically focused on Vlad the Impaler, as in the historical figure, and tried to make him a sort of woe is me, melodramatic, I did this for the greater good, like I pillaged and wreckaged all these people because it did good in the long run. It's like, and it was just a mess. But they definitely had a similar tone, and seeming like they were trying to make these classic Universal monsters and repackage them into a hero and villain sort of story. And with, a lot of Marvel films, obviously there has been great financial, turnaround, and that the fan base usually tends to show up for each one and likes, someone from this other film might show up at the end, where it seemed like that's what they were trying to go for, like trying to make the Universal monsters into the next Marvel, which they were kind of going for with the Dark Universe reboot with the, newer ones, which originally they were kind of in between Dracula Untold and The Mummy, ultimately, which I think was the 2017 Mummy with Tom Cruise. Mm-hmm. And that one just failed so abysmally. They kind of pulled back. And luckily, since Universal monster films that are more modernized or a different take have been singular. And I like the idea of a bigger overarching sort of horror universe. Like, it was fun to have Jekyll and, well, I guess just Hyde and Frankenstein's monster and Victor Frankenstein and Dracula in the same film. And that's kind of throwing back to some of the later sequels of some of the original franchises too. So the idea is fine, but you have to keep those dark roots of what they were and not try to repackage it into an entirely different genre, in my opinion.
Yeah, The Wolfman with Benicio del Toro went a little more in that darker direction, and I was okay, I guess. There was some stuff in there that I liked. I like the vibe and the atmosphere, but I don't really remember much about the story. The Mummy with Cruise, that one, I don't know. They just went to almost Stephen Sommers in that with your comic sidekicks and I don't even remember. I watched it again a couple of months ago, and it was worse than I remembered it. But that one made something like 400 million, actually made back its money. And I'm surprised that it wasn't enough to continue it, but I'm glad that they didn't. The Invisible Man, that was a good one.
I loved Invisible Man. That was really well done. But they kind of they took it seriously. They were, and what would be horrifying about if this was happening today in this other perspective? And it was more like even kind of psychological horror in a way.
Yeah, that was definitely a next level script.
And you are a bigger fan of the superhero genre overall. Do you feel like those should just be separate things? How do you feel about a horror universe maybe adapting more of a traditional horror and villains as you would see in a lot of superhero movies like Marvel?
Because there were a lot of crossovers very early on, even with Abbott and Costello and that sort of thing, or your Wolfman meets Frankenstein, and there's like every variation there exists, and there's a precedence for that, which I think works and historically has been successful. But for the sake of just emulating a successful action by Marvel, I think is the wrong inspiration. But it's possible. I think it could work, but it just starts to feel too formulaic and at the expense of really telling the story.
There was a little, I would say this film was less so, I guess but there was a little bit of an element, especially in Dracula Untold, but a little bit here too, where, I don't know, it's like the characters definitely weren't fully fleshed out, but it seems like with this hero instinct, it's almost trying to tone down sort of some of those dark roots and who these characters were of, oh, there has to be a reason, or they do these things, but it's for the greater good, or Dracula just can't help it, or, you know, something like that, where it's like there's some villains should just be dark and ill intent and vicious. Like, not everyone has to be the anti-hero, I guess.
There's an unsung hero element, which they seem to have, or self-sacrificial. And another movie that was very actually close to Van Helsing was I, Frankenstein. Have you seen that one?
I have. I remember liking it at the time, but I might have to go back.
I do like it more than Van Helsing, but it's still basically an action movie dressed, or a horror film dressed as an action film. It does lack the character depth and the proper credit given to the source material, but it is very, very similar and very much an action film in itself.
Dracula, while I have seen worse depictions, left much to be desired. He's predatory, suave, and ruthless, but also comes across as unremarkable and empty. The hypnotic, mesmerizing, reveling in his nature charming vampire with subtleties is gone. He works as a dangerous foe, but comes off as more style over substance and less of an intriguing character than in many other versions. I wasn't crazy about the casting and performance of Richard Roxburgh, but I think it was more the writing, direction, and vision of this version of the character. Dracula's brides were perhaps my favorite portrayal of the characters in the film. They nailed the range of emotions and qualities these characters should embody: ghastly horror, utter devotion, cunning treachery, and maniacal glee. As horrible as the visuals of the CGI and the voiceovers were, there was something about them coming into their bat forms that offered a nightmarish power and relinquishing. I inherently feel a deep connection and protectiveness of Frankenstein's monster in any version. There were some moments with the monster here I could appreciate, such as his desire to simply exist in a world that is against him, after no more than a glance. There are occasional moments of dialogue and an overall emotive air to the monster that reference what made the original Frankenstein's monster so powerful. But it feels like an afterthought sprinkled in lazily and often immediately undermines itself. I don't expect every character to be exactly the same in a film reboot many decades later that is clearly taking liberties with the genre and tone, but it's a shame to include such a multifaceted and beloved character that is among the most legendary and loved monsters, and do so little with him.
Contrary to the zombie-like 1931 Karloff performance, the Frankenstein monster here is portrayed as laughably operatic, continually wailing, and philosophical. The film begins with him loudly lamenting the death of his father, as he calls him, Dr. Frankenstein, who only brought him into existence a moment before, a man he never even conversed with, a man he could not possibly understand his relationship with. Regardless, would you say this version of the monster is perhaps more in keeping with the original Mary Shelley novel?
Well, I think there wasn't enough time because, like, as you say, he probably in reality wouldn't even be understanding anything at this point. In the beginning, he doesn't even understand language. It's after he is sort of abandoned and his immediate moment of being in this world is his creator, his father, rejecting him. So that part is very inconsistent. I guess you could say he didn't get the chance yet, but it's not until he's very much alone and isolated and learning what humanity is and finding himself thirsting for knowledge and love and understanding and culture as a whole that he slowly sees both things that intrigue and enlighten him and seeing caring, relationships with other people and seeing that this can exist. So it doesn't really have the time or space to really get there. But yes, I would say that's a bit forced and almost like they were just rushing, like, oh, there needs to be something dramatic here. He needs to be woeing over something, and there's plenty of other things that would be very in tune with the character for him to be lamenting over, and the loss of someone who he wouldn't even really know, and in reality is someone who would have turned his back on him is not the best choice.
And he shouldn't even know who he is himself. What the fuck am I doing here? I mean, he was just pieced together from all these body parts. What's going on? Things like that. Not just instantly cradling his quote-unquote father like that. It just seemed, like you say, very, very rushed.
Yeah, at least one moment of bewilderment. What is this? Who am I? Life, at least have a little moment there. But yeah, they really didn't really put a lot of time or investment into that character. It was like he was there, and there was certain lines that were almost like, okay, this is what the fans like of him, so we'll throw in one line of, I think he has one moment of, what do you want to exist? Which, okay, that's consistent with the character. He just wants to be, he's been brought into this life, which wasn't his choice, and he just wants to exist and have some form of what it is to be human in his skin. But then he immediately gives them reasons to kill them after. So it was just like, yeah, just very sloppy, lazy writing, and probably things that this character in reality would never say.
Yeah, I think he was even quoting Shakespeare a few times. And for me personally, it was the Karloff performance that I loved so much because he didn't say anything in that first movie anyway. It was this whole, it's like when you look at your dog and you're like, what are you thinking? Like, what are you just sitting, what's going on in your head? But in the monster, it created a sense of mystery and intrigue about if he's even alive or is he just dead or what level of awareness does he have. But when he's just so flamboyant and self-sacrificial and heroic, yeah, he's got muscles, but there's not really much there that makes sense.
Yeah, agree with that.
Now, there's something off, generally speaking, about the casting I can't quite put my finger on. They're all good actors, but besides being your standard overly attractive leads, Few of the cast really possess that sort of Tim Burton-esque or Coen Brothers level of distinctiveness in their characters, the exception being Igor, who was my favorite in the film.
So for me, Igor, I really didn't like the look of him. More so, I don't know, it was almost like they were trying to make him another Frankenstein's monster just in the visual. Like there was at times where I had to remind myself that it wasn't Frankenstein's monster. Again, I guess he overall played the role of yes, master lackey, but I don't know, the character was just very lacking for me. It wasn't aggressively like, oh my God, this is a horrible portrayal of Igor, but it just didn't do a lot for me. So what did you enjoy about the character?
He had some lines that actually made me laugh, despite all the other humor that fell flat in the film. And according to the commentary, those lines were ones he improv'd. So
right.
there's something about the fact that the funniest lines were the only lines that Stephen Sommers did not write, and somebody just made up on the spot. Yeah, I liked him, but I agree his makeup was a bit too much, and I don't remember. I think he should have had a hunch or something. I don't remember him having a hunchback, and that was a key point for me. Although, was it Fritz was the actual character with the hunchback, and they later adapted it for Igor or Igor, however you want to pronounce it.
Yeah, I think that character for me was Mr. Hyde, as short-lived as he was, but he was wonderfully voiced by the talented Robbie Coltrane, which took me a minute to realize that. I was looking through the cast. As a huge Harry Potter fan, and specifically an avid Hagrid fan, it was fun to hear such a different voice acting role from Coltrane. His moments were tongue-in-cheek and over the top, but still fun, and seemed to really embrace the monster and dark lore in a way that was equally elated and nonchalant. Like his response, "We all have our problems," response to being accused of being a deranged psychopath. There was just a sort of fun, tongue-in-cheek quality to it. I kind of feel like this film would have been more fun and interesting if it was Van Helsing versus Jekyll and Hyde, with a preferred emphasis on Hyde. Their energy, banter, and antagonistic nature towards one another, while short-lived, was a lot of fun. I liked a lot about the conceptualization of the monsters, especially the goblin fairy-like bat forms of Dracula and his brides, but the execution was painful. In a moment of attack, Dracula reveals a mouthful of large, razor-sharp teeth that expand. These were a bit more bestial monster than the subtlety of the original Dracula, to say the least, but I can give them some leeway here for having the desire to amp up the level of deadliness and just for the sake of presenting a different version of what a vampire might look like. Still, it was a very cheesy, over-the-top moment.
The biggest error for me is not that the effects are dated, but that they show us too much in vivid detail, leaving nothing to the imagination. I would even argue this to be the film's biggest flaw, CGI or not. Art is based around communication, and any communication is most fulfilling when it's two-way. But this film only clobbers you with one-way communication. It doesn't let you contribute anything back into it, any meaning, anything from our own imaginations. It doesn't let one think about anything. It just bombards us with excessive visuals and sounds. The result is not a particularly engaging experience and leaves one feeling beaten down for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Again, not unlike a Michael Bay film.
Yeah, I definitely can't say I felt really any connection, and any that I did was more in fleeting moments of what was already established in these original characters, and then was really only a letdown with what they did with them. There definitely is a lack of subtlety, and that was, I understand, to a degree, a modern horror film, big budget, which is not to say that you can't have suspense and artfully create a horror film. That's ideally what we want. But I guess it's understandable to have a little different of a expectation, but what you're should be honoring and building off of, there was a lot of subtlety, especially in, well, really all of these films, but just even, for example, Dracula as the character, he was, really nothing was very overt, And of course, a lot, like there was very little, shown at all at that time. But even beyond what was shown, if you were just to play out what this scene would have been like and what it would have looked like in your mind, there was a little bit more of almost his hypnotic power was almost, and in some ways, the most daunting and horrifying, that if you were placed under his spell, that he could just have total control over you, which is very psychological and body horror. There's a lot of different types of horror and how evasive that can be. Yeah, there was a certain unweaving and slowly coming on into his spiderweb, so to speak, where just having everything shown in the brutality, and even the brutality, it's like I almost feel like if that was kind of there, but it was like you're almost like numb to it just because it's so overdone without really just letting the horror of the character itself and certain complexities and the power that he has. It was just kind of erased, and you just kind of become numb to everything.
This film uses homage after homage, many of the most remembered moments from the Universal classic films, but creates the most bombastic versions of them. The dialogue is fairly atrocious, and for as many stabs at lighthearted humor, although it did lighten the tone, there was little funny here to me. Its humor was more broad, which is to say, obvious humor, complete with a bungling comic sidekick. Yet I cannot condemn this film entirely. Part of me appreciates the grandeur, the spectacle, and sheer scale of all the work that went into it from its many craftspeople. Barely, though. Perhaps the 10-year-old me would have loved it. Regardless, I have to say the ending to me was as cringy as the end of The Rise of Skywalker, and even includes the cliche of riding off into the sunset. Literally.
What's most lacking in Van Helsing is the story and emotional investment. If you simply want a film with a lot of action-heavy battle moments and some supernatural elements thrown in, this might be enough to satisfy you. It just didn't do it for me. For me, this does not feel like it was made for the fans. It feels too watered down, generic, and lacking in identity. I think the standard of writing and depth just needs to be higher. Hold on to the horror and complexities of these characters. You can explore that in new ways, times, or settings, but you must honor the roots. Some genre mixes work and some don't and come off as a lesser version of both. Overall, while the style and origins of the characters that were enthralling from what I knew of other versions could have caught me, it just was disappointing and didn't do enough with the material.
The music was composed by the legendary Alan Silvestri, who wrote the iconic scores for Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, Predator, and The Avengers. It was distinctive enough, but could not save this movie. Instead of elevating it to a higher state, the rest of the film brought the score down to something more generic when set against all the cringy actions portrayed. The score, like everything else in the film, felt very swashbuckling, meaning depicting excitement and adventure, especially in a historic setting. Not sure how swashbuckling fits with Universal classic monsters, but that's what we got.
I didn't notice the score a lot when I was watching it. I did listen to it after. Overall, I think it works. It wasn't anything exceptional, but it built atmosphere and had upped the drama and ante at certain moments. I briefly looked on some of the awards for this film. There were a lot of nominations, a couple of awards, and I think the music was the only legitimate award that it won. It was also nominated or won some awards for being the worst in their selective categories. Let me see, Fangoria Chainsaw Movie Awards. It was nominated for Worst Horror Film of the Year. It did not win. Actually, The Village won.
Really?
Which I like The Village too.
Wow.
But I know it angered some people, so I guess that makes sense. And then as well, Richard Roxburgh and Kate Beckinsale were both nominated. They were both nominated for Worst Accent. And Beckinsale was also nominated for Worst Actor. Roxburgh took the win on that one. Which I didn't like him particularly. Again, I didn't love that version of Dracula, but it seemed more what was written for him and just their vision of Dracula just didn't do a lot for me more than his performance being noticeably just horrible.
In the back of my mind, I actually pictured you as seeing him and going, oh, I know him from all of these other movies that he was in, and would have said, oh, I liked him, but maybe he wasn't that great in this role. But somehow, I don't know why, him specifically, I thought you would like. And I personally always thought he was not Dracula at all. And that extends to most of the characters in this film for me. It feels like it's just an odd sort of polished, shallow sort of casting procedure that everyone is just too pretty, or it just, I don't know.
I didn't love the look, but like his look, and I don't even know if it was his acting abilities. It was very like him, and all of the characterizations were very style over substance. So almost like, ooh, this is the feel, or like be predatory, be creepy, and then like that was it. Whereas that's not necessarily what's interesting and compelling and so lasting about these characters who, made an impact 100 plus years ago, and still you see young children who still know Dracula and Frankenstein and are still taken by these characters. It's more of those complexities within them. Even, Frankenstein is a little more sympathetic, but and even a lot of like Creature from the Black Lagoon, I think, was as well. A lot of them have that, but like Dracula wasn't really meant to be sympathetic at all, but there was still this complexity and this allure and mystery, and there was just a lot more to the character.
You mentioned liking The Brides. I thought they were too melodramatic for my taste.
You know what? I'm a big fan of vampires who embrace their nature. And I very, very much hate the woe is me or like even lackluster vampire. So really, I just loved the passion. Whatever they felt it fully. And it was a little bit of nods, I think, more to like the Hammer horror kind of period of Dracula, where a little over the top, ghastly horror. But still, they went there. They committed. And it just felt, it brought some liveliness and the horror alive a little bit for me.
Did you think, like The Haunting 1999, this was going to be a guilty pleasure of mine? Did you think I suggested this film because it was a film that I liked, that aligned with your perception of my taste in horror? Or were you just not really sure when you watched it? Like, fuck, should I say something good about this film, or should I just tear into it and be honest?
Well, we don't really discuss what we think about films beforehand. So sometimes it's a bit of a surprise, or usually it's like, I wonder what Steve thinks about this one. And definitely when we were about to hit record on this today, I was definitely interested, intrigued to see what you would think. I know you said you're harder to be intrigued. Definitely as a film fan, and if it's tapping into something I'm already a fan of, not necessarily that I'm easy to please, but I'm definitely the optimistic viewer and critic. And I had some very, very negative sentiments as this movie was ending. So yeah, I figured, again, I kind of felt like definitely very tongue-in-cheek, and I know obviously you're a Universal Monster fan, so it felt like there could have been a little bit of, at least when I was first watching it, a little bit of like, oh, it's homage and it's just having fun with these beloved characters. But yeah, as it went on, and I hadn't seen the film before, but a little bit of the reputation was that it's not very good. It's not very highly rated. So I figured you weren't going to be like, oh, this is a masterpiece. But yeah, it was interesting to get the full view. And you actually were a little bit, I want to say more negative, but yeah, less enjoyment than I might have expected. But that makes sense that it was a film that was a wasted opportunity, which I definitely can agree on.
During the commentary, Stephen Sommers and the editor slash producer, they say that they're recording it a week before the film is released. And they have no idea how well it's going to be received. And something about that just makes me feel kind of like bad for them. They seem very pleased with it, and they were talking about test screenings and all the cheering and laughing, constant uproarious enjoyment by everyone who watched it. And
there seems to be some fans. Sometimes will log and see other people's opinions on like Letterboxd is one platform. And yeah, I just saw some comment that really enjoyed it and thought this is a film really made for Universal monster fans. And I'm like, really is it? But I guess it hit with some people, but overall definitely doesn't have a very high approval rate.
All right, so I have a couple of plot holes. First, there was a weird thing with the vampires and werewolves where they would transform back into human form, and their clothes would sort of morph back into existence. I don't think we're meant to think too hard about these things, but it did stand out to me.
I mean, that's pretty bad. Even Twilight covered that. They're like, no, he's going to be naked when he wakes up. He's going to grab some clothes. That's you don't have to see it, but again, it's just another example of nothing really living in this world of reality. Again, yes, it's fantastical and some otherworldly elements, but you have to create some sort of realism in any script, or any story period.
The premise centers around Dracula and his three brides desperately trying to procreate. These three women somehow birthed thousands of enormous cocoon-like pods which bear flying bat-like infants, each somehow capable of lifting a full-grown human into the air. Beyond the math not mathing there, that's just not how vampires reproduce. They do so by biting others into becoming vampires and thus spreading their numbers.
Yeah, it's a pretty key element of vampires that they can't procreate, or if they do, even with humans for the most part, So yeah, I guess if you're gonna go there and you're gonna say, well, no, our vampires can, like, give a little bit of a reason of what this phenomena is.
Yeah, and you look at this huge space filled with cocoons that are about the size of my torso or bigger. Mm-hmm. And how were those secreted from these three women? I mean, your mind goes into some pretty dark places, and the volume of them, it doesn't make any sense at all.
Maybe they birthed them in their bat goblin fairy form or whatever you want to call that.
It could be. It does actually remind me of the X-Files movie Fight the Future, where they had a similar scene, but there were aliens in the end, and they were all bursting out and coming after our protagonist. So I don't know if that was lifted from that, but it did come out at least 5 years after X-Files, so you never know.
I think by the time we got to the ending, I was still watching. I was trying to see where they went, but I was kind of subconsciously checked out of like, just nothing in this movie is working, and I'm not going to think too hard or take too much seriously. But yeah, there was some turns at the end with, without saying too much, Van Helsing's identity and just where they went with it seemed kind of forced and last minute, and it's like, if you're going to go there, like, have a little bit more exploration or reasoning, and didn't really like that angle. And yeah, there was just a few sort of lazy tacked on things at the end.
Apparently Gabriel is a biblical reference, and I don't know my Bible well enough to tell you who, but
Archangel.
Well, they say he'd been around since the Romans, that sort of thing, which again stretches Van Helsing's character so much far removed from what I presume was in the book, much less in the Dracula film. And they never explore that. They just acknowledge that him and Dracula knew each other centuries before, and there was something that caused him to wipe his memory. He doesn't remember it, but they never touch that again. And maybe there was an intent to make this into a franchise where they would explore that in future films, but that left me scratching my head and feeling a bit frustrated with the writing.
Yeah, he really never has any exploration or growth or dimensions or anything in his character. It's kind of brazenly kind of thrown of, oh, I don't really remember who I am or my family or my origins early on, which is, okay, a little odd. But you think that, especially once they reveal, oh, this is who you are, that should have some impact, something, whether his memory comes back or not. But it's just like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to keep on being Van Helsing, the hero monster slayer.
And they keep treating him like he's just a normal human being. They don't say that he's got some sort of special strength or power or ability to withstand pain or suffering. So I'm not sure, is he just frozen at that age forever? Or does he have some sort of angelic or godlike capabilities? Like, who is he? At the end of the movie, I still have no idea who this guy is.
Seemingly he should. I mean, I guess they could have established that, like, oh, he was an angel, but now in his human form, he only has human capabilities. But yeah, that's something that could have been very easily established that wasn't. Something else that came up was the basically downfall or weakness of vampires in this lore felt very forced and convenient with like kind of the werewolf.
Well, okay, now touching upon that, we have many vampires that die in this film by the means that they should be killed. Yet they say specifically that they've tried everything on Dracula and none of it worked. And we see attacks which kills other vampires in his vicinity but have no effect on him apparently. Why would he be exempt from those same weaknesses from all other vampires? What the fuck, Stephen Sommers? Like, this makes no sense.
It's kind of how I felt when the credits roll and it said written and directed by. I'm like, huh, okay.
When Dracula dies, I don't remember how he died. I couldn't figure out why he died. I played it back a couple times. I'm like, what happened just now that made him die? So even when he does die, it's confusing.
Yeah, I agree. It was just kind of like, okay, the movie's over. It's time for him to be dead. But yeah, if you're gonna, you would think, again, that the whole thing is this action and hero versus, or angel versus the demon, essentially. If you're making this big, huge battle building up to this, you would think they would just let that be a big, clear moment.
Mm-hmm. And he would go on about having no heart. He feels nothing, while screaming it in the most emotional, dramatic argument with his brides. Like, I feel nothing! Like,
I know, that was a painful moment.
One of many. If you would like to join our Society of Grotesquerie and Loathing, subscribe now and give this podcast a like.
And be sure to comment your wretched thoughts below.
Keep our podcast suffering on by finding it in your cold, black, withered hearts to support us on Patreon.
A link to our PayPal is also below for one-time donations of any amount.
It was nice knowing you.